Every single one of these words is related. One, inch, onion, ounce, university, alone, Angus, and many others. And in this video, I'm going to tell you the story of how this happened and how all these words came to be. Hi, I'm Danny Heber, PhD in linguistics, and this channel, Linguistic Discovery, is all about the science and diversity of language. And today we're going to explore the history of the word for one, all the way from the original Proto-Indo-European language to the many subtle ways that that word still appears in modern English today. So put on your etymological adventure hat because we've got a 6,000-year journey ahead of us. So the English word one can be traced all the way back to a Proto-Indo-European word hoinos, which also meant one. Now, Proto-Indo-European is the hypothetical ancestor language from which all the modern Indo-European languages descend. So that includes languages like English and Spanish and Portuguese and Russian and Hindi, French, German, Irish, and about 400 others. All of these languages are distantly related, and they can be traced back to that same original Proto-Indo-European language. In this video, we're only going to look at the versions of hoinos that wound up in English, because if I tried to look at the descendants of that word in all of the Indo-European languages, this video would be 6 hours long. Now, sometimes English inherited those words directly from the Proto-Indo-European language, but sometimes it borrowed descendants of hoinos from other branches of the Indo-European language tree. So we'll start by looking at those words that English inherited from Germanic, and then we'll explore words that English borrowed from other branches of the tree. So the most direct descendant in English of the Proto-Indo-European word hoinos is the modern English word one. But one isn't just a number in English. It's also an indefinite pronoun that means someone or somebody, as in expressions like one would think. This came about because of influence from French. The French word on means somebody or someone. English speakers started using one as both the number and the indefinite pronoun after the Norman French invasion, when French became the language of the ruling class. Now let's jump back a little bit to Old English. The Old English version of one was on, and on got used so frequently in a handful of expressions that those expressions actually merged together into a single word and gave us a word in modern English. For example, the phrase all on literally meant all one, but it was used to mean something like entirely one or completely alone. And this became the modern English word alone. The word alone, in turn, was shortened to the word lone, and that later developed into the adverb form lonely. Another example of a phrase with on was at on, which literally meant at one, but metaphorically was used to mean in agreement or in accord. And that phrase became the modern English word atone. The meaning shifted from in accord to making reparations for, because one of the ways that you can be in accordance with someone is to offer them reparations. A third phrase was on, which meant in one, in the sense of in one moment. The word on in Old English could mean both on and in. On eventually became anon in modern English, meaning in a short time or soon, like in the expression more on that anon. This process of merging two words into one word is called univerbation, and we're going to see this happen a couple more times in this video. Now, Old English nouns also had suffixes that are called case markers, and these case markers told you the function of the noun in the sentence. So whether it was the subject or the object or the possessive. So the possessive form of on was anes, and that meant of one. And after a few pronunciation changes, that became the modern English word once. Anes was also used in the phrase for then anes, which meant for the once, meaning on this particular occasion or in this instance. The word then in that expression is actually an old form of the word the. But many speakers heard that n at the end of then as belonging to the word anes instead of then. So the phrase became for the nanes instead of for then anes. This is what's called rebracketing, where a sound is reanalyzed as being part of a different word. The word nanes then came down to us in modern English as the word nonce, which means occurring only once or used only once. It's a term that's used today in programming for like single-use cryptographic keys. And side note, this word nonce is completely unrelated to the British term for a sex offender. Those two words are just accidental homonyms. Now, that's not the only time that the Old English word on was involved in a rebracketing, too. It became so common for on to function as an indefinite pronoun, meaning someone, that it became the indefinite article a or an in modern English. There was so much variation in whether the n of on was perceived as being part of the word on or part of the following word when that following word started with a vowel, that eventually the pattern generalized. So today, the word a is used before words that start with a consonant sound, and the word an is used before words that start with a vowel sound. So we've gotten all of these words already just from words in Old English alone. So now let's climb down our etymological tree a little bit from Old English to the next closest branch, which is Germanic. By the way, if you're enjoying this video and you want to learn more about the science and diversity of language, you'll probably love the Linguistic Discovery newsletter. I do weekly deep dives on topics in linguistics, language profiles, explainers of different concepts, reviews, and more. So if that sounds up your alley, go check it out at linguisticdiscovery.com. When the early Germanic peoples branched off from the rest of the Indo-Europeans, they began to pronounce hoinos as ainas, and that's the word for one in Proto-Germanic. Ainas not only gave us the modern English word one, but a couple other words as well. So first, ainas could take the adjective suffix gas, and that's actually the origin of the modern English y suffix. This Proto-Germanic word einagas literally meant one e, but it was used to mean only or singular or unique, and that became the modern English word any. Ainas could also take the suffix likas, meaning like. So eine likas meant one like. And of course, likas is related to the modern English word like, and that's the origin of the ly suffix. So in Old English, eine likas became an lich, literally one li, and that became the modern English word only. Ainas in Proto-Germanic could also be negated with the word ne. So the phrase ne ainas meant not one, but that underwent that process of univerbation and became nainas. In Old English, nainas was pronounced as non, and in modern English, that word is the word none. So now we're at the last etymology from the Germanic branch of the Indo-European tree. And this is going to finally explain the great mystery of why English uses special words for 11 and 12 rather than saying 1-teen and 2-teen like the rest of the teens. There's some evidence suggesting that early Germanic had some influences of a base 12 counting system. So in other words, early Germanic speakers might have counted by 12s rather than by 10s. One piece of evidence is that the Old Norse language, which is related to Old English, used a mix of a base 10 and a base 12 counting system. The Old Norse word hundrath meant 120, not 100. So 12 groups of 10 rather than 10 groups of 10. And the same thing was true for the English word hundred. The word hundred could still be used to mean 120 up until the 1400s. Today we call 120 a long hundred instead. A second piece of evidence is that in the earliest texts ever written in Germanic languages, like the Gothic Bible, there are notes in the margins explaining to readers that certain numbers should be read tentywise or in a base 10 system. And these notes wouldn't be necessary in a society that already consistently counted by tens. A final piece of evidence that early Germanic peoples might have counted by 12s rather than 10s come from the words for 11 and 12 themselves. In Proto-Germanic, these words were eine lief and zwei lief, meaning one left and two left, in the sense of one left over after 10 or two left over after 10. This style of counting past the base is called overcounting, and it's actually well documented in other languages as well. For example, Old Turkic would express 27 as 730, meaning 7 towards 30. And it's perfectly natural to say things like we're 2 over in the context of numerical limits. You might say this if there were more people than chairs available, for example. So now imagine if this way of conceptualizing numbers were the only way to express 11 and 12, and that's how those words come about. The reason that the overcounting stops at 12 in English seems to be that early base 12 influence. So the Proto-Germanic eine lief became endelaufen in Old English, and that developed into the modern English word 11, while zwei lief eventually became the word 12. Now that we've perused the Germanic descendants of the Proto-Indo-European word for one, let's turn to some other branches of the Indo-European family tree, and the words from those branches that have wandered their way into English. I use the word wander intentionally here, because all of the words from here on out were not inherited by English from Proto-Germanic, but borrowed from other languages. And sometimes those words were borrowed very early in the history of Indo-European, and sometimes they were borrowed much more recently. So there were two historical events in particular that really inundated English with a lot of words of Romance origin. The first was the Norman invasion of England in 1066, and the second was the Renaissance. The Normans brought the French language with them into England, and it became the language of the ruling class. And that marked the end of the Old English period and the transition into Middle English. English itself was practically unwritten from that point until about the late 1300s. French is a Romance language, meaning that it's a descendant from Latin, so nearly all of the vocabulary that English borrowed from French is ultimately of Latin origin. And it's also important to remember that many of these borrowings happened during the period of Old or Middle French, before many of those words had taken on the pronunciations and spellings that they have in modern French. So some of these words from French might sound a little different, and that's why. During the Renaissance, on the other hand, scholars borrowed many words directly from Latin, just bypassing French entirely. So let's look at those words that came from Latin by French first. The Proto-Indo-European word hoinos became unus in Latin, still meaning one. Unus formed a part of a bunch of other words in Latin, and then French inherited those words before foisting them onto English. The most straightforward example is the Latin word unicus, which meant soul or unique, and that became the French word unique and was borrowed into English as unique. Unus also became part of the word unisonus, meaning same sound, and that became the French unison and English unison. The Latin word universus meant whole or universe, and literally meaning turned into one, and that was borrowed into English later as universe. Universus also had an abstract noun form, universitas, which meant a community. It was an extension from the sense of the whole community. This later came to refer specifically to academic communities, and that gave the French word université and later the English word university. Another fun but maybe questionable etymology is the Latin word unionem, which meant onion. And the idea is that it might have referred to the unity of an onion's layers. That word could also be used metaphorically to mean pearl, because onions were sold on a string, so a pearl necklace looked like a string of onions. The Latin word unionem became the Old French oignon, and that became the modern English word onion. Now remember how I said that some words entered English earlier than others? Well, sometimes the same word could enter English twice, or even more than twice, once early in the language's history and once later. This would yield two different words in modern English. When two words in a language share a common historical source, they're called an etymological doublet. So a few examples of doublets are host and guest, ward and guard, and pipe and fife. Each of those pairs of words have the same origin. This is what happened with the Latin word uncia, meaning one part or unit. So even though it literally meant one, this word actually came to mean a 12th part of something rather than a single part of something, because Romans divided many types of goods into units of 12, such as the pound and the foot. Middle French inherited this word as once, at which point English borrowed it as the word ounce. Now today an ounce is 1/16 of a pound rather than 1/12 of a pound, because at one point the standard for what constitutes a pound was changed, but it was originally 1/12. Now that was the later borrowing, but 1,000 years before that, before Old English even existed, the Germanic tribes of Northern Europe were trading with and fighting against, and sometimes even fighting for, the Romans. And as you might expect, those Germanic peoples borrowed many of the words for items that they bought from the Romans, including a lot of their units of measure. One of those units of measure was the uncia. Then a few centuries later, some of those Germanic peoples would settle in Britain, and they would mix their West Germanic dialects into what eventually became Old English. One of the words they brought with them was the word unce, meaning inch, and that was derived from the Latin word uncia. But remember how I said that a word could also be borrowed more than twice? You guessed it, uncia was also borrowed into English later, around 1650, as the word uncio, which referred to a particular type of large script that was used from the 4th to the 8th centuries. It was called an uncial script because the letters were inch high, i.e. really big. There are two other descendants of hoinos that came to English through French, but not through the Latin word unus. So we call the period from the earliest written Latin inscriptions up until about the classical period Old Latin. And in Old Latin, the word for one was oinos, before it later became unus. You could negate the word oinos with ne, forming the phrase ne oinos, meaning not one. So just like we saw earlier in Proto-Germanic, how the phrase ne ainas, meaning not one, underwent univerbation and became nainos, a single word, none, the same thing happened with Old Latin. Ne oinos became noenum, meaning not. And that, possibly, there's some uncertainty here, became the classical Latin word non. English later borrowed the prefixed form of this, non, from French, and now it appears in many words such as nonplussed, non-believer, non-fat, and countless more. The last reflex of hoinos that came through French is actually a close parallel to non. So if we go one step lower than Old Latin on our etymological tree, we get to Proto-Italic, and that's the ancestor of all of the Italic languages. The Romance languages are the only languages in this branch that survived, but we have historical records of other Italic languages too, such as Faliscan, Umbrian, Oscan, and Picene. In Proto-Italic, you could add a diminutive suffix, meaning little, to the word oinos. So that gave you the word oinolos, meaning little one. And you could also negate that as ne oinolos, meaning not even a little one. By the time of Classical Latin, that phrase ne oinolos had become nullus, meaning no or not any. In French, nullus became null, and English then later borrowed that as the word null. Now we'll end our climb around the Romance branch of the etymological tree with a quick look at those words that we borrowed directly from Latin, which usually happened during the Renaissance. These tend to be pretty straightforward. So Latin unitus, meaning united, was borrowed as unite, and unitas, unity, was borrowed as unity. And the word unit, in turn, comes from an alteration of the word unity, by analogy to the word digit. You might also expect that the English word unary was borrowed directly from a Latin word like unarius, but there was no such word in Latin. And instead, unary was modeled on the pattern of binary and ternary, using unus as the base. There are a lot of other words with the uni prefix as well, such as uniform, meaning one form, or unilateral, meaning one side. Two last quick ones are the words unanimous and unicorn. Now, what's actually interesting about unanimous is that it displaced an Old English word that meant the same thing. The word was onmode, meaning one-minded. Now, at this point, you might be asking, when does this video end? And did English borrow words from other branches of Indo-European too? And the good news is I can answer both of those questions at once. Kind of surprisingly, there's only one other branch that English borrowed descendants of hoinos from, and that is the Celtic branch. So for our last stop on the etymological tour of one, we're going to turn to Celtic. The Celtic branch of Indo-European contains Irish, Welsh, and Scottish Gaelic, just to name a few of its biggest members. So the Proto-Celtic version of hoinos was oinos, just like in Proto-Italic. And this word appeared as the first part of an Old Irish name, oingis. The second part of this name is uncertain, but it's either from a word gustus, meaning strength or vigor, or maybe the word gus, meaning to choose. So oingis could have meant either one strength or one choice. In the Pictish language, this became the name Oengis, and there was a Pictish king, Oengis I, who ruled over a region of northeast Scotland, which is today called Angus, after him. And this region, you might have already guessed, is home to a small breed of beef cattle called the Aberdeen Angus, or simply Angus. So Angus beef is the last leaf on our etymological tree. So now we've got all of these words in English that derive from hoinos. And it's not too surprising that the word for one could have so many uses, because it's a very multifunctional number. Across the world's languages, words for one are used more than any other number, making them very prone to univerbation and to becoming function words. You may have also noticed in our little scamper through the etymological tree that the same word and concept can develop independently in different branches, or even at multiple times within the same branch. Both none and non come from a construction meaning not one, for example, while both any and unique are etymologically one-e. Proto-Germanic had the suffix likas, like, which became the modern ly suffix, but modern English also uses like as a suffix, and words like cat-like. All this isn't entirely coincidental. Some concepts are simply a common part of the human experience. In other cases, the development of a word or phrase in one language can be due to influence from another. So as I talked about, part of the reason that Old English on developed into the indefinite pronoun was because of influence from French and Latin. But it's also important to consider what you're not seeing when you look at these reconstructions. So Old Latin developed this word noenum, meaning not. But do you really think that Old Latin just didn't have a word for not before that happened? Of course it did. Linguists work under the assumption that languages today behave similarly to the way that they did in the past, because the humans of 2,500 years ago are not meaningfully biologically different from humans today. This is called the uniformitarian principle. And since every known language today has a way to signal negation, it's totally implausible that Old Latin wouldn't have had some way of signaling negation. So why did Old Latin speakers bother creating a new word noenum if they probably already had a word for not? Well, to put it simply, words lose their novelty with repeated use. And the more frequent a word is, the faster this happens. When a word becomes less novel, speakers have to reinforce its meaning with other, sometimes seemingly repetitive words. So think about negation in French. Old French originally had just one negative, ne, but this really lost its pragmatic strength, and so speakers introduced a second negative, pas. Now this double negative isn't really logically contradictory, because the purpose of the second negative isn't negating the first, is to reinforce the first. And this holds true of double negatives in every language, including English. This process of renewing negatives in languages happens so frequently that we actually have a term for it. It's called Jesperson's cycle or negation cycle. Another reason speakers have to coin new ways of saying the same thing is that frequent words tend to get phonetically reduced over time. For example, the word not in English is often just reduced to nt in many cases. And phonetically, sometimes this is realized as nothing more than just like a slight glottalization of the preceding vowel. So originally in American English, you would say cannot, a nice full complete phrase, but now a lot of times that's pronounced as merely can't in certain dialects. And that sounds almost exactly the same as can. This makes it really hard for non-native speakers and even native speakers to hear the difference. So how long until English needs another negation? This process of renewing old words that have become meaningless and phonetically reduced is called, fittingly enough, renewal. And this explains why we see parallel structures develop in different branches of a family tree. If the proto-language had a particular construction, and that construction was frequently used, the child languages are probably going to need to find innovative ways of expressing that same function as it wears down over time. Frequency is kind of like erosion. Given enough time, even the toughest linguistic boulder wears away because of it. And so we've come to the end of our 6,000-year etymological journey. Thanks for watching.